the New Testament, you're on the post-Christ age. Um, those of you who've been saved, you've got the Holy Spirit. None of that was there. You've not been affected as much about paganism as the Egyptians were in the Israelites. But now at least you understand that there was multiple gods worshipped, there was multiple beliefs, and for over 400 years, folks, the Israelites had not heard from God. The last big event that we know of recorded was with what God did with Joseph and Jacob. And after that, all they had to hold on to for 400 years was a story that got older and older and older. So they knew about Yahweh, they knew about God and what He'd done in the past, but they didn't have any recent evidence. And so typically what happens is you grow further and further away from God, and God had a purpose because He's growing them as a nation, but He's also allowing them to be exposed to a lost world so that they will understand the uniqueness of who God is in comparison to the false gods. And that's what I want us to look at as we do this study, that as we look at it, I want you to look at the character of God and what He's doing in these situations. Beginning in verse 1, He begins to name all the sons of Jacob and the different 12 tribes. And each one of these are the fathers and head of the 12 tribes that we know of as Israelites, and they become a great nation. Verse 8 talks about a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. They did not have kings in Egypt. They had pharaohs who were a god, but it's a reference of a change in leadership. We don't have any conclusive idea who this was. It really didn't matter, other than that the pharaohs and the ones that had lived and knew Joseph and knew the God of Joseph had been overcome and had been defeated in battle. And now we've got a new kingdom. As they begin to look, now they're looking out there, and all this small family has multiplied into a great number. And they continue to multiply. And they begin to be afraid of them because of the way God was blessing them. And so because of that, they begin to try to figure out what to do. So in verse 11, it talks about they appointed taskmasters to afflict them with hard labor. You know, one of the things that a lot of things happened back then is you tried to conquer people and make them work and become your slaves for two reasons. It lowered your enemies and their standard, and it caused them to be indebted to you, but it also allowed them to build all types of beautiful architectural things and benefits, infrastructure, and various things like that and stuff. They're trying to figure out how to get it up there on there. We're going to get old Michael trained up in time to send him off to school this fall. Caleb was supposed to show you all that stuff before he left, but he didn't, did he? So anyway, it's going to be hard to keep up with me, Michael, because I'm jumping through there. But anyway, verse 12, but the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of the sons of Israel. So, see, during all this going on, God continued to bless. Now, if you go back just 100 years ago, what was the survival rate of most babies back then, do you think? Pretty low, wasn't it? 100 years ago, well, matter of fact, my wife, out of the 10 10 of them, there was only 3 of you born in the hospital, right? Zachy and you and Cheryl. So 7 of them were born at home. Anybody else in here right now that was born at home? Yeah, see, several of y'all were born at home. Wasn't uncommon. But also the death rate was pretty high because of the mortality. Then in the influenza coming in and killing. So mortality was pretty high. But yet what God was doing with his people, they weren't being afflicted by some of these things that happened. The average age probably for most Egyptians was somewhere between 40 and 50 years. And so you would have been an old man. A lot of us would have already been dead if we lived in this period of time. But they lived a long time. They raised children for a long time. So God was really blessing them. So the Egyptians began to hate them even more. So they began to try to come up with a way to stop them after they're making them do mortar and bricks and all kinds of labor in the field. That's verse 14. The king of Egypt spoke to the midwives, and they named 2 of them that were there. What's a midwife? All right, they're the ones that come around and help deliver. So these babies being born at home, they were the traveling nurse that would come around and help deliver. So Pharaoh thought, well, I'll talk to them and they'll know right off if it's a male child, we want to kill the male child, but we'll let all the women live. So women, you think you're being oppressed. Look at that. I mean, they were trying to kill all the men. Oh, and that causes me to question, because first of all, the men are capable of doing most of the work, but they decided to get rid of the men and control population. I don't see how that worked, because there's still going to be plenty of men around and stuff. But that was what they wanted to do. Partly probably because they were fearful of the men becoming soldiers and rising up against them. So they weren't as afraid of the women as much as they were the men, because the men could grow up into an army and the army could defeat them, and they were fearful of that. But God just keeps blessing, because he laid it on the hearts of these midwives not to do this. And folks, this really put them in danger of death. To go against a direct order of Pharaoh, it's really puts them in a very hazardous place. So when Pharaoh questioned why are all these young male babies out there running around, they said, well, they're a hardy group of people. Said they birth on the birthing stool, and they've already had the baby before we ever get there. And also said they're not like the Egyptian women. Probably a lot of truth to it, because all that slavery tend to make people pretty hard. If you look at our generation today and compare it to mine and your grandparents' generation, man, we couldn't measure up to half a day work of what our great-grandparents did. I mean, I heard stories of those old men went off to World War II, and said they'd put them in a group of men from the city, and them old farm boys are sitting there, and they said, man, they feeding us 3 times a day, and all they want us to do is carry a gun and a pack. Said, we've been doing, ain't no mule in front of us. And I heard them talk about it. I said, man, that was the easiest thing we'd ever done. And to eat all the foods you wanted, and that's all you got to do is walk around and march with a little old pack on your back. I mean, they workers, but the guys in the city who had it easy, now they struggled. But when you work hard your whole life, like a lot of our parents and grandparents, this generation today couldn't hold up. They were tough. You know, you look at pictures of a lot of our older grandparents. You don't see many of those women smiling. You know, it was a hard work, raising kids, washing clothes on a rub board and carrying what, I mean, cooking on the stove and stuff, getting your water out of the well, all the things you had to do. And on top of that, in East Texas, it was hot. And then it was cold. I've told y'all about the house Barbara and I lived in. I mean, it was real nice to lay in this feather bed and watch that curtain blow that far away up from the, just blow out there and wave like a flag over you all night long. And you get married in December, you cuddle up in the wintertime. And the house I was living in, the man raised his 2 boys there. They were gone by the time he moved into a house that had any kind of decent walls, but no insulation. I mean, they were tough, and so were they here. And so you've got to understand, through all that, God just keeps blessing them. So what does that tell you about God? What can you learn from this? I'll tell you one thing I learned. The more that the enemy tries to persecute God's people, the more God blesses his people. So the more the world tries to persecute God's church, the more he blesses his church. Now, folks, this is a spiritual truth you're going to have to grasp. Most people don't want to face persecution because we don't like it. But the times the church was at its strongest, the times in history when the church was most effective, was always during periods of persecution. I don't know why Satan's not caught on to this truth. Undoubtedly, he doesn't keep an ongoing record, or he'd quit persecuting the church. Because when churches have it easy, that's when they tend to do less and are least effective. And we've been growing up in a generation right now where everybody basically got it made. They may not be financially wealthy, but you got a dishwasher at home. They got washing machines, dryers, and you got all these conveniences. And then you go work another job so you can buy more conveniences. Y'all anybody here not have a phone in their pocket right now, or a cell phone? Anybody? 2. Well, you're all right, but you didn't bring it. But you got one. Nancy doesn't have one. Barbara has one, but she didn't know where it's at. Anybody else? 2 people in here. Now, y'all make fun of me because I got a flip phone. But only 2 people in here do not have some kind of device that they can talk to somebody on. Now, I can text, but I can't pull up. A lot of you got. So, you see how far we've come? You got air conditioner, the early church met wherever they could, when they could, and really thrived. A lot of their families pronounced them dead. When they converted to Christianity, they pronounced them dead, and literally would not disown them for their faith. But what God's showing us right here, he's laying the groundwork for what's about to come, but he's also showing you some of his character. And folks, if you want to know who God is, look at his character as he records it in these books. His character is, you be faithful to me, and I will reveal great wonders to you. The other thing is, he did this in preparation to raise up a spiritual, physical Messiah who would be named Moses. Now, Moses was not the firstborn. If you read this, you would think he was the firstborn, but we know Aaron was his older brother, and we know he's got a sister that was old enough, because through all this, God was laying the groundwork for Moses to spend 80 years in school. God's going to spend about 38 years in Pharaoh's house. Because of what Pharaoh was doing to try to kill him, when Moses' mother had him and knew that they were going to try to kill him, she put him in the bulrushes and stuff, sent her daughter with him to put him and hide him out in a place, not knowing what would happen, hoping somebody would find him and raise him. She didn't know. But she knew she wanted this child to live. But look what God's doing. He sends just the right person to find Moses so that he could be raised up in the house of Pharaoh. Folks, if any other person had found this child, the child would have been put to death. But because this woman was the sister of Pharaoh, she had the ability, because of her royal connections, to keep a child that was doomed to die. And she did. God put in her heart a compassionate, merciful there, caused her to be there just at the right time, and caused Moses to be there just at the right time. And he would not be weaned till he's 2. So anyway, she finds him. Little big sister comes running out and said, "Hey, do you want me to go find you somebody to nurse this baby?" "Yeah, we'll pay her." So who does little big sister go find? We're going to go find Mama. So Mama gets to raise her own child and raise him up until he becomes aged to be weaned, which would have been somewhere around 2 years old. And could have been a little older, a little less, somewhere around 2 years old. And she was there. But then she had to give him up. Now, mamas, how hard would that be? Now, see, you gave him up once. You get him back. Now you raise him up again. And we're going to let him live in the house of Pharaoh, knowing the paganism that's there. And knowing not what the future would hold. But she had to give him up. But God knew what he was doing. See, we read this thing so quickly without thinking about what's going on. We just assume, boy, all this is there. But think about the emotions. And how God, you remember when I preached on faith 2 weeks ago, and I got to the T and I said, trust. Trust. This is what this is. This is when you have to trust God to do whatever he needs to do. She had to trust God. So God allows him to live there for about 38 years, grow up, learn all there is to know, gain great wisdom and insight into the kingdom. But he never forgot his roots, because that's what got him in trouble. And we are over in chapter 2, so Michael, you can just quit worrying about it. But as we go through this story, what gets him in trouble? He kills who? Kills an Egyptian for doing what? Beating a Hebrew. So Moses knew his lineage. He knew who he was, and he despised it. So even though he had been raised in the house of Pharaoh, I bet he was too. Well, he may not, because circumcision didn't come on. Well, yeah, it did. It was through Abraham. Yeah, I don't know if they kept practicing, but he still held on to his roots and stuff. That might be something I have to research and see, because there was a period of time the Israelites quit doing that as an outward sign, and they reestablished that. But and I can't remember where that is, Bob. But he held on to the root, and it bothered him to see Now, it wouldn't have bothered any other Egyptian to see an Egyptian beat an Israelite, but it bothered Moses. So he killed and healed, huh? Yeah, yeah, he was still tied, and so he had held on to that the whole and never shunned that during this 38-year period. But see, God's still orchestrating this, folks. God knew there was going to be a time that he'd have to flee because he had to move him out. But see, God has been working in Moses' heart to hold on to that family tie, to hold on. This is my aunt and uncle. They visited from Alabama, so this is Dean and David, and coming in late and stuff. But that's all right. They came to see their favorite nephew. The least favorite, anyway. So see what God's doing when you don't visually, you don't see it, but is God not still working in all these situations? Because he's got a master plan. Moses does not know this plan yet. He kills the Egyptian. He thinks he gets by with it. The next day, he sees two Israelites fussing and fighting, and he wants to stop them and get on to them. And they say, "What are you going to do to us? Kill us like you did the Egyptian?" Uh-oh. It's all over. The news is out. Throughout the land of Goshen, they know. So he flees. He wasn't a good politician because he would have known if he was a good politician, he would have known he could have got by with it. But it scared him. You see, God was already working in his heart and putting it in there to fear what would happen because it was time now for him to leave. Because now he just moved into high school. All this other was elementary. You're learning some stuff, but God said, now I'm fixing to do 40 years of graduate school. We're going to take you in the wilderness, boy, and we're finna teach you some sure enough where you're going to go from a prince in the house of Pharaoh to a nothing over a bunch of sheep and goats out in the wilderness. Now you're talking about different levels. And why would God do him that way? Why would he do him that way? What's God working in Moses' life? How do you go from the house of Pharaoh? Why didn't God just take him right over there? Because he might have been able to convince Pharaoh to let him go. He had to bring him to a point where he could understand what the people were doing. He had to bring him down. He had to show him and teach him some faith. Most of us think God ought to just rip open our head and pour up a bunch of faith in there and zip it back up and say, now you're ready. Folks, that's kind of like praying for patience. You pray for patience, you better get ready. And you need patience. But let me tell you how God's going to do it. He's going to take you through some fiery trials. But that's where you get faith. You don't only get patience that way. That's where you get faith. God says, I need you to step out. I need you to trust me when you can't see anything else. I don't know. I was debating on some. I'm not going to say anything, but there were some things going on in my mind this morning about some stuff, and I was praying about. And a lot of time when I get to thinking about things, I think about what if. Yeah, I go, do I need to do this? Do I need to do that? Make these adjustments. And I always end up coming back to what God's promised me. He said, don't worry. I'll take care of this. You know, with the banking failures and all that's going on and how it's affecting people, I tend to worry about budget sometimes. And I said, well, what if this? And I try to think about, okay, how do we continue to minister and do all these things? And And, and God's blessed us. We're going to be, everything we're going to do right now when we paid for. But what about next year? We might not, but we may. And when I'm doing that, that's when I have to stop and ask myself, what did my God teach me? What did my God tell me? And I always go back to what He's told me. He's got this. And that satisfies that. So when you're at this place where you're concerned about things and God's giving you an answer, it's good. It's okay. Don't worry about it, but go there and ask Him. Say, okay, God, before I go any further down this journey, do I need to make these adjustments, or do I need to think about this? And let Him see what He says. Because today He didn't tell me any new revelation. He just reminded me of what He had said. And I said, okay, that's what I want to hear. I want to hear you tell me you've got this year too. And I trust you. And then I quit being concerned. Because, folks, the church has really been blessed and we're doing a lot. But I've watched churches be blessed, and what happens is people begin to say, well, they don't need this money. Or either that, or the worst thing is worse than anything, we need to put all that money back in case. What if the air conditioners go out? So I've seen that, and I've always said that's not walking by faith. But when you're there as a leader, I've got great elders, and I trust them a lot, but I have to make sure I'm where I need to be. Because when I make recommendations, they tend to trust me in what I'm doing. So my leadership style is I'm just super cautious and make sure I'm where I need to be and that I'm following God's will, so that when I recommend something, I'm comfortable with it. So that's what I was doing this morning. I'm just trying to make sure I'm comfortable with where it's going to go. And God just reassured me, I've got this. And I said, okay. Because I'm not a what if, because if God took care of today, He can take care of tomorrow. And I know this church, first of all, if all the money's gone tomorrow, we're going to make it because everything's paid for, and I'll preach for nothing. I have in the past. I don't preach for money. We can live without air conditioning. We can live without a lot of things. It's nice to have. But are we going to quit worshiping God because financially it got too hard? I hope not. Because as long as we've got breath, as long as we've got there, we need to walk with God. You've got that because of your history and your knowledge of God. The Israelites did not have that. They were learning that. This story is their journey from paganism and super exposed to paganism to learning to trust the character of God. When you get saved, you're moving from paganism to trusting God. The Old Testament will give you some of the most beautiful pictures of the God that loves you and His character, so that you will know that He is dependable and that He's got this. He had Moses. He had a reason for Moses to go into the wilderness, and He had a time for Moses to come out of the wilderness. And He was going to take care of everything. Just like He had a reason for Joseph to be sold into slavery, and yet He spared his life, put him in prison, brings him out, puts him in the Pharaoh's court, lifts him up, just in time to save Daddy and the kids and the brothers. He had a purpose. You've got the background. This is what I want you to know. If God did it for Moses, if God did it for Joseph, He will do it for you. If you're walking with God the way they did. Now, if you're not walking with God, you're rolling some dice, folks. I'm telling you, God's looking for people that are faithful and true to Him and trust Him. And that's why we have all these answered prayers about people, diseases leaving, medicine being paid for, various things that you did. That's because you trust God. All right. Build upon that event. Even though you didn't experience, for those, Melinda and all of them, Amy and these that talked about it, that's something for you to grab hold of. So when you face it, you're saying, God, I want to trust you with this. And Lisa's lungs and stuff, doctor said, you got all these problems, and then it's gone. Sherry, the person that was going by her van the other day, just bailed out on her. She thought, matter of fact, I watched her, they showed it, they're going by it. She brought it down here. She trusted them. That was number one mistake. Huh? But God still had a plan, and I think a better person ended up with it. But you could have got frustrated. You could have got angry. You could have, but God had a plan. And I promise you, He got a plan for you if you're His child. And He's going to do something with you. And so that's chapter 1 and chapter 2. We'll spend a little more time next week on the burning bush. But chapter 1 and 2 is just a picture of God spending 80 years getting a servant ready to do what He needed to do. Men who are called to preach do not begin to be ready the day they get called. God's already been working in them. If God's calling you to be a missionary, He's already been working in you before He ever calls you. He's laying the groundwork. He knows where you've been. He knows where you're going. You've just got to hold on and walk with Him and trust Him. I'm going to go ahead and spill the beans. Cut the internet off, please. Okay. I'm going to tell you because it's unofficial.